I believe I am now live. So let me just have a look-see and make sure. It says I am in fact live, so yep. All right, hello. Good evening or good morning or good afternoon or good whatever time of night or day it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to Republic News. I'm your hostess, Liviana. This is the second of my After Saint shows, and the title of this episode is JM/Fury. If you want to know what that means, then by all means, feel free to go and check it out. So, as usual on my After Saint show, I will be doing some going over the recent news to see what's been going on and talk about it a little bit and so forth. So, with no further ado, then I will begin. My goodness, what's going on? My first article is actually a throwback to the year 1944, if I'm not mistaken, but it is something that was discussed relatively recently on when was this published? Well, it was in March, so relatively recently. It was, in fact, this year at least. And this was published in Prospect Magazine. It would, of course, be nice if everything would cooperate. I think it's going to now. Okay, so this is called An Economic Bill of Rights for the 21st Century. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt proposed constitutional amendments to guarantee Americans fundamental economic rights. It was never adopted, and today is more necessary than ever. Here's an adaptation of his program for our time. The article is by Mark Paul, William Darity Jr., and Derek Hamilton, published the 5th of March, 2018. So I just got a message. Let me make sure there's nothing wrong here. Okay. Acknowledged Gator. Economic mobility has drastically declined since the 1940s. Unemployment and underemployment are persistent problems, especially for stigmatized groups who are subject to discriminatory exclusion from employment opportunities. In today's economy, the American dream is just a dream, or worse, a rhetorical device that draws attention away from the economic reality playing out across the country. Despite long-term growth in the nation's gross domestic product, in real terms, middle-income Americans have less than they did 40 years ago. Poverty, especially amongst the most vulnerable in our society, our children, persists at unjust levels. Despite President Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty declared more than 50 years ago, 43.1 million Americans remain in poverty, nearly 20 million of whom live in deep poverty. There is no question that past policies intended to reduce poverty and have fallen tragically short. It's time to think big. The rules that govern our economy are working best for far too few at the expense of far too many. And it goes on and on. So, let me get to... In his groundbreaking 1944 State of the Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt called for an expansion of the Bill of Rights to recognize economic rights as well. Quote, necessitous men, end quote, Roosevelt observed, quote, are not free men, end quote. Those, quote, who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made, end quote. Moreover, real freedom to, quote, pursue happiness, end quote, he said, required a second Bill of Rights, quote, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, end quote. For Roosevelt, full citizenship demanded more than the political rights designated in the nation's original Bill of Rights. It required economic rights. Roosevelt outlined those rights as follows. Now, I want to pause here just for a moment and point out Roosevelt was very ill at the time of his 1944 State of the Union address. And so, instead of doing what he usually did, going and addressing a joint session of Congress and having video footage made, he did a radio broadcast from his own home. But this part of his State of the Union address he did have filmed because he said he wanted to look the American people in the eye. So these are the rights which Roosevelt included in his Economic Bill of Rights or Second Bill of Rights. Number 1, the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. Number 2, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. Number 3, the right of every family for a decent home, or to a decent home, sorry. Number 4, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. Number 5, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. Number 6, the right to a good education. Roosevelt died before he could begin a national movement to enshrine these economic rights as a constitutional commitment. In subsequent decades, though prominent politicians and civil rights leaders continued building on Roosevelt's pursuit of economic justice, seeking to extend the scope of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and the New Deal economist Leon Kaiserling drafted freedom budgets that recognized that poverty remained a great barrier to opportunity and expressed the need for strong federal action to bring economic equity to all Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. joined this campaign for jobs, education, health care, housing, and income for all Americans, and before he was assassinated, he planned a new march on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, to demand economic rights for all, linking the civil rights movement directly to a movement for economic rights. Today, how far we still remain from anything that resembles equality as fact and result. We need to rethink public policies, breaking out of the straitjacket that overemphasizes market-based solutions. We have thought big before, but have compromised big as well. During the Great Depression, FDR and liberals made a Faustian bargain with Southern segregationists to provide a New Deal and beyond, rewriting the rules of our economy, but only for some of our citizens. Ira Katznelson's excellent book, When Affirmative Action Was White, An Untold History of Racial Inequality in the 20th Century America, documents how U.S. public policy implicitly and sometimes explicitly excluded black people from opportunity during the so-called Golden Age that followed. The racial apartheid that existed under slavery was renewed under another name, Jim Crow, for decades. Now, this actually started sometime before Roosevelt, before Franklin Roosevelt was even president. So, the exclusions from the guarantees of the New Deal contributed to the highly unequal outcomes we observe today. Now, I will pause yet again to say something I have said before, and that is in reference to Franklin Roosevelt's second vice president, that is Henry A. Wallace, That was the 33rd Vice President of the United States. There were a number of reasons why FDR wanted him to be his vice president. His first vice president was a Southern conservative Democrat, and he had broken with Roosevelt completely after the 1936 re-election campaign. He had never supported the New Deal, so Henry Wallace was named by Roosevelt as his Secretary of Agriculture after he took office for his first term in 1933. Henry Wallace was a progressive Republican at the time, and sometime around, I think it was 1936, he became a progressive Democrat. So when Roosevelt was running in 1940, he wanted to choose Henry Wallace to be his new vice president. He was done with the other guy. And the Democratic Party establishment just absolutely went ballistic. No, you can't have Henry Wallace. There's no way. But Roosevelt told them, and I've said this before, here and there. Roosevelt told them that he just wouldn't run for re-election then. So, they backed down and let him choose Henry Wallace to be his vice presidential running mate. In 1944, however, when he was running for his fourth term, as I've said, he was ill at this point in time, and the Democratic Party establishment put their foot down and refused, absolutely refused. By heck, you're not going to have Henry Wallace as your vice president again. And FDR was too ill, too weak from his illness to fight them this time, so he reluctantly agreed to have Harry Truman as his vice president. So he was reelected and immediately made Henry Wallace his Secretary of Commerce. Wallace continued in that position until 1946, when Truman fired him, and we can go on from there, as I've done before. Wallace went on to become the editor of the New Republic. He used that as a platform from which to launch attacks on Truman's policies, especially the Cold War and the arms race and so forth. And then in 1948, having formed a new progressive party, Wallace ran for president. He didn't win. But at any rate, the reason I bring this up now is because I want to point out why the Democratic Party establishment didn't want Wallace in the first place and successfully got rid of him the second time he would have been running as the vice presidential candidate. That was because Henry Wallace was an advocate of expanding women's rights and ending racial segregation. Well, the Democratic Party at the time, and for quite some time after, had this history, this custom of compromise between, say, like your East Coast, say New England liberals and Southern conservatives in the party. And this was one of the things that the Southern conservative Democrats insisted on: racial segregation, Jim Crow laws, and so forth. In the 1940s, there were, late 40s, I think it was 48, I'm not sure, I'd have to look it up, but there were some of the Southern conservative Democrats who left the Democratic Party and formed their own party, which was called Dixiecrats. They ran a presidential candidate. He lost, and they gradually were reabsorbed back into the Democratic Party. 1960s, when LBJ, the the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act, a lot of these Southern conservative Democrats or Dixiecrats left the Democratic Party in protest. And, well, you can guess where they went. But anyway, I did want to digress a bit on that. So, let's see here. So the article continues, today we must transcend the racial, ethnic, and regional divisions exacerbated by post-Depression and post-World War II era politics by building universal policies that are cognizant of identities and intersectionality and inclusive of race, gender, nationality, sexuality, and ability. The first 6 rights outlined by FDR above are still all too germane today, but to update these economic rights to facilitate an inclusive economy in the 21st century, we add Number 7, the right to sound banking and financial services. Number 8, the right to a safe and clean environment. Number 9, the right to a meaningful endowment of resources as a birthright. You know, I have a video up on this channel where I talk about intersectionality and what it was originally intended to mean and what it has been perverted into. And if you want to talk about identity politics and things like that, I talk about that a little bit in the same video. It's called Solidarity versus Intersectionality, in which I point out that leftism and regressive outrage culture and victim mentality are not the same thing and are often at odds. I don't want to go into great detail about it because I talk about it fairly often, and certain people get annoyed when I repeat myself. Even though there may be people in the audience tonight who have never watched any of my videos before nor heard me say anything about these matters at all. Suffice it to say that I do not consider myself a regressive outrage monger, what some people call by other names that we don't have to go into here because I don't like those names. They're very inaccurate. But I am a modern progressive. Now, some of these regressive outrage mongers call themselves progressives, but they're not. And if you don't understand what I mean by that, if you want to accuse me of a no true Scotsman or any of that other shit, by all means, go check out my article on Real Progressives, wherein I explain exactly what I'm talking about and exactly why I do have the right to make these distinctions and say those are not progressives. I am. And there are other people like me who are progressives. We are modern progressives. Those people are regressive outrage mongers. They don't even know the history to know what progressivism is about. So they shouldn't be calling themselves that. But I explain why they do in the article as well. It's at the Real Progressives, realprogressivus.com or .org. Crap, I don't know. Anyway, I should know. You just have a real brief kick here and see. Yes, it's at realprogressivesusa.com. And the article is called The Name Progressive, Its Proponents Would Be Usurpers and Wannabe Exploiters. So please go and check that out when you get a chance. I think you'll find it at least somewhat interesting. But I'm going to continue to read this article, a little bit more of it anyway, because I do think it's interesting. And the reason that I'm actually talking about this tonight is because there are several other things that I want to be talking about in this show, in connection with some of the second Bill of Rights or Economic Bill of Rights, which FDR proposed. So, I mean, I don't have any problems with these number 7, 8, and 9. I mean, I would be curious to know exactly what they mean by number 7, the right to sound banking and financial services, and they do talk about what they intend by these things in the article. But I'm not going. Whenever they talk about the right to employment, one of the things that they say here, skipping down a bit, is what the nation needs is a program established through federal legislation that would guarantee employment to every American at non-poverty wages. Similar legislation to what we envision has already been introduced to Congress, House Resolution 1000 Jobs for All Act, which has 29 co-sponsors. In our proposal, we would first establish the National Investment Employment Corps, NIEC, a permanent agency to oversee direct employment of all Americans seeking a job. If individuals were unable to find adequate employment in the private sector, they could turn to the government for employment. In return, the government would provide employment at non-poverty wages. The minimum salary would be at least $24,600 per annum. Advancement in the program would be possible, resulting in a mean salary of $32,500. It goes on a bit longer. Talks about the price tag, which is nearly, it says, we estimate that the federal job guarantee, inclusive of total compensation, training, and materials, will have an annual cost of about $575 billion, which is nearly 3% of GDP. But that will not be the net expense of the program. Since the program functions both as a full employment and as an anti-poverty program, a portion of the expenditures the United States currently devotes to a variety of entitlement programs could be reduced significantly. This would include lower expenditures for unemployment insurance, SNAP, or other types of means-tested social programs. Moreover, it is not extraordinarily difficult for government to fund large-scale problems. The fact that at the outset of the Great Recession, huge amounts of public funds quickly were turned over to the banking community suggests that there is a huge capacity on the part of the federal government to meet large new expenses. A federal job guarantee would enable the nation to fund the well-being of all our citizens rather than support narrowly the folk who produced our most recent economic crisis. It goes on to talk about how the program would function. And then, let's see, it says, we envision an array of jobs that would address both our nation's physical and human infrastructure needs. Such a program could rebuild our crumbling roads and bridges, and they could also provide vital services like elder care and child care. Imagine if the government mobilized resources to provide universal, high-quality elder care. Its positive impact would not be limited to the direct recipients of the service, but it could also reduce dramatically the stress, time, and monetary expenses now borne by relatives who now have to provide or pay for all of the care work themselves. And it just goes on. And as usual, I'm going to include the link to the article and all the articles I will be discussing tonight in the video description. So check back. I'll try to get some of these in there before the show is over, but no promises. Tomorrow, at least, they should be there. So if you want to come back later and look at the video description to see my references and sources and whatnot, they will be there. So this goes on. It talks about a number of other things like, the right to health care, which was part of the original Second Bill of Rights proposed by Franklin Roosevelt. It talks about right to quality education. Here we are. This is the first point that these three guys have suggested: the right to sound banking and financial services. So Wall Street profit incentives are often not aligned with Main Street economic development, and nor are the more conservative Federal Reserve's financial policies, such as the Fed's staunch opposition to full employment. We must offer an alternative to the predatory nature of the current system of finance. The financial system has continued to redline opportunity in this country, particularly for financially vulnerable groups who have been deprived from asset development by the bank's policies of housing discrimination, limited high-cost basic banking services, last resort exploitative lending practices such as payday lending, and the pushing of subprime loans even on credit-worthy Latino and Black borrowers. Recent estimates indicate that 20 to 40% of the U.S. population relies on some form of non-traditional financial services, such as payday lending, which disproportionately preys upon vulnerable and low-income Americans. Moreover, 53.6% of black households and 46.4% of Latino households are unbanked, underbanked, which is likely related to the high costs of banking for low-income individuals and the scarcity of banks operating in black and Latino neighborhoods. A recent U.S. Postal Service report found that the average underserved household spends almost 10% of its income on alternative financial services and interest. Converting one's paycheck into cash should not bear a penalty, particularly for those with limited resources. There are currently 53 million credit-invisible households in the United States, households that do not frequently participate in forms of financial services that the major private credit bureaus incorporate in credit scores. This credit invisibility results in the further marginalization of this group, limiting access to credit and employment, and increasing costs associated with financial services. According to the think tank Demos, while most low and middle-income white households with credit card debt report good credit, the opposite is true for African Americans. Further evidence from the Federal Reserve indicates that less than 1/4 of blacks reported prime scores, compared with roughly 65% of whites. As a result, blacks are more likely to receive subprime mortgages and pay more for accessing other financial products, such as car loans. This need not be the case. A public option for banking and basic financial services could provide all Americans with the right to a minimum non-exploitative standard of banking and financial services. Like the job guarantee, public banking would generate a floor in the financial sector. If private banks don't provide services at least as good as those provided by the public option, we expect consumers to close their accounts at private banks and public banks. Public banks are not a new idea. In 1910, Republican President William Howard Taft introduced the U.S. Postal Savings System to fight against the predatory lending practices of the finance industry at the time, providing Americans an alternative that they could trust. This system functioned until 1966, when the banking lobby helped convince lawmakers to end the public option for banking and financial services. One state, North Dakota, still operates its own public bank. The state uses tax revenues to fund the bank, providing high-quality loans to farmers, students, and local businesses. Other countries, including Japan and Germany, currently have more extensive public banking options, and Germany's municipal banks are a chief source of funding for that nation's thriving small and medium-sized manufacturers. One approach for public banking is to revive the postal banking option. The U.S. Postal Service already provides alternative financial services via money orders to the tune of $21 billion in 2014. In a recent white paper, the Office of the USPS Inspector General noted that, quote, while banks are closing branches all over the country, mostly in low-income areas in both rural communities and inner cities, the physical postal network is ubiquitous, end quote. A postal bank in the U.S., including from the FJG, that's Federal Jobs Guarantee Program, can bring banking services to the unbanked while providing an important revenue stream for the USPS. To provide Americans with access to reasonable financial services, another reform would be to federalize the credit score industry. Credit reports and scores have a direct and growing impact on Americans' economic security and opportunity. Credit scores, which in theory represent the creditworthiness of consumers, are used to govern access for a range of basic economic needs, ranging from a car loan to a lease on an apartment to a job. These scores function in part as a gatekeeper to credit, which is central in today's economy to build wealth and fully participate in the economic system. However, the credit scoring system has long been opaque and deeply flawed. Something as influential as a credit score in determining life outcomes should not be left in the hands of the for-profit, unaccountable private sector. All right, so certainly the payday lenders and those places where you go to cash your check if you don't have a savings account or whatever somewhere. Yeah, I can see those are very they are predatory. Not to pull any punches about it. They certainly are. However, I'm not entirely sure on what I think about the idea of public banking. I'm kind of reticent to say, yeah, go for it, because some of the people who advocate that are proponents of American Monetary Institute, kind of, let's do what we can already, let's do what we already, it's basically, we already have the wheel, but we're going to destroy it and build a new one. So, I mean, they want to talk about nationalizing the Fed. The Fed is already nationalized for the most part. I mean, there are private banks that own shares in the Fed, and they do receive dividends. And that's about the extent of what would need to be done to fully nationalize the Fed. And they don't get that. They think they need to actually have the Fed taken over by Congress, which would be kind of ridiculous, because the Fed acts on the basis of what Congress authorizes. Now, what the Fed does exactly, so apparently I'm offline now. I'm not sure why. I'm going to guess that, no, I don't know. Apparently my stream is complete according to YouTube, but I don't know why that would be the case. And now it says video output low, so I don't know what the hell's going on. Let me just have a look-see here. I wish the cats would stop jumping around my stuff and maybe I could stay connected. I don't know why they're so hyper tonight, but anyway. Let me have a look-see and make sure that anything is still happening out here, because there was some discussion in the live chat that looked interesting. Am I still live? Apparently I'm still here. Yeah, it was a brief interruption. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. You can hear me. All right, then. Basically the thing is, the AMI people want to... I'm not really sure who they want to take over the Fed, but the thing is that the Fed is already under the authority of Congress. The Fed can't do anything except what Congress authorizes. But there is some leeway that when the Fed acts, it does act in a way to try to implement what Congress has told it to do. The specific details of that are left up to the Fed. And this is a good thing, because why? Because most Congress critters are not even familiar with basic economics, let alone more advanced, I mean, they've not studied macroeconomics. They don't know much about economics at all, frankly. A few of them might have studied economics, and a few of them are on committees where they will have been given sort of a crash course and will learn more as time goes on. This is one of the reasons why when people start talking about congressional term limits, I kind of cringe a bit, because yeah, I can see a need for it. If someone has been in Congress for like 30 or 40 years, maybe they've been there too long. But at the same time, you kind of need to be there a little bit longer than a couple or 6 years in order to figure out what the hell you're doing and start being able to be effective. You can't just jump into the deep end of the pool until you've already learned how to swim, so to speak, as I've said about other things. Now, we'll be talking about a universal health care system as well. And the point is, it's not socialized medicine. It's nationalized insurance. There is a difference. So all these people that are shrieking about socialized medicine and talking about Medicare for all would just be socialized medicine. No, it wouldn't. It's regional boards of governors, which are made up of healthcare professionals, not government bureaucrats. And so instead of what we have now, where we have private for-profit insurance companies running death panels, we would have actual physicians and nurses making those decisions. You know, people that are not concerned with trying to withhold paying out for coverage in order to maximize profit for their shareholders and executives. Well, that would be H.R. 676. It's a House bill as it stands now. I know that Pramila Jayapal is supposedly rewriting it, and we're all very concerned to see what she's going to do, because if she makes it more like the Senate bill that was proposed by Senator Sanders, then it's going to be a weaker bill. H.R. 676 is, as it stands now, is the gold standard for national improved and expanded Medicare for all. And what that actually does is it takes all of the current federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid and the VA and brings them together into one. And then so you don't have like 3 or 4 different agencies doing the same thing, basically. So it kind of streamlines a bit. It also allows for the government to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies on pricing, which they can't do now. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why drug prices are so high. They can charge whatever they want, and there often is no rhyme or reason to it. I mean, did Martin Shkreli really need to increase the price on that drug as much as he did when it cost far less than was already being charged? No. Did Senator Manchin's daughter need to increase the cost of the EpiPen so much when it was already making a profit and only cost, like, I think 37 cents to make? No. It's just pure and simple greed. Oh, but research and development, fuck you. Research and development is done in universities and funded by the government. That's where most research and development for medicines and drugs comes from. It's not the pharmaceutical industries that are paying for research and development. The pharmaceutical industries are paying their executives and their shareholders. That's where their profits are going. So don't tell me about research and development. I know better. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the next article now, because I think I've said pretty much everything I want to say about this. Let me go ahead and and copy the URL into the video description here. I don't know if it's actually going to survive, since the stream seems to have disconnected briefly for some strange reason. I'm not really sure what that was about. It's very annoying. You kids stop jumping around over here before I beat your butt. I'm not actually going to hit them, don't worry. But, you know, I have to yell at them occasionally to get their attention, because they're hyper. Let's see. Okay, so you're going to settle down and behave. Yes, you are. I'm going to put this into a WordPad document, and then into the, oh, Jesus Christ, that's not going to work at all. Undo that now. I'm gonna put it in here first. Yeah. So, geez, would you guys stop? Fuck, goddamn, what the fuck? I can't do anything. You're bouncing everything around, and I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Stop now. Holy fucking hell. It's been like this ever since I got home from town tonight, or this evening. I don't know what the hell is going on with them, but they're just hyperactive, just completely losing their minds, jumping around and leaping across the bed, and this is not normal behavior for them, so I don't know what's going on. But yeah, let me copy the link here, and I'm going to just save it into a notepad document, and then I will add it to the video description after, because that way I will be sure that it's actually in the video description and not like in part of the video description or whatever. Okay. So my next article that I wanted to look at, yeah, let me see here. I want you two to settle down. Settle down. Blue, let me see. I'm not sure actually, backed this one up or not. It would be very nice if they weren't bouncing around here on me. Let's see. Yeah, I did actually. Okay, so this is an article that is called Blue State Revolt, and it's by Eric Blanc, and it comes from, I do not know where. Let me take a look real quick and see. It comes from, Jacobin magazine. So you're worried about Marxists, so I'll go, yeah. Jacobin is certainly a socialist publication, maybe I mean, they do talk about Marxism quite a lot, so I think maybe some of their writers are Marxists. Yeah. So this is published, well, I'm not really sure when it was published, but, because it didn't, sometime this month anyway, and I had linked it to myself this past Saturday, so it's at least that old. And that was a little after noon, so yeah. So this is Blue State Revolt by Eric Blanc. Get off of my bed and quit bouncing shit around before I bust your ass. I mean it. Get off. Get off. Sorry. It's official. Los Angeles teachers just announced they are going to strike on January the 10th. They are challenging not just public education privatizers, but the Democratic Party establishment. After months of contract negotiations, Los Angeles teachers have announced that unless the LA school district leadership gives a dramatic set of last-minute concessions, they will begin a strike on January 10. The stakes of the struggle could hardly be higher. In the second-largest school district in the country, educators have thrown down the gauntlet against the forces of big business, gentrification, and privatization, including those within the Democratic Party. Yeah, see there? A lot of people don't realize that the Democratic Party is all about that. That's what the Democratic Party establishment is for, ever since the late 80s, and certainly since Bill Clinton became president. They embraced neoliberalism, which was the economic policy that Reagan instituted. Every president, every administration since January of 1981 has used the same neoliberal economic policy, with the possible exception of Donald Trump. I'm not entirely sure, and I've said this before, but I think he might be an objectivist or a neo-objectivist instead of a neoliberal. He's not a radical departure from the same stuff we've had for the past 40 years, but there are some differences. And it's sometimes difficult to tell the differences between objectivists, neo-objectivists, and neoliberals, because they do a lot of the same stuff. They're all for deregulation and kind of anti-labor policies and a lot of things like that. But there is one very notable difference. Neoliberals will subsidize industries. They favor subsidizing industries and giving bailouts, like to corporations when they fuck up. Whereas the objectivists and neo-objectivists are like, nah, we're not doing that. So, I mean, they would both eventually wind up at the same point, but the objectivists and neo-objectivists would take a little longer to get there than the neoliberals. And I'm going to be very blunt, that point is not a good point. It's a dystopian hellhole. Look at Honduras and you can see the kind of shit that happens when those kind of... yeah. So anyway, I'm going to go on here. But yeah, so the point is the Democratic Party is absolutely into this corporatism thing. And so is the Republican Party. I mean, you do have exceptions, individual members within both parties who are not. Certainly the rank and file members are not down with all of this, but most of the rank and file members have no idea what's going on with this. But you do have a few individual elected officials who are not down with this. So you'll have some of the progressives in the Democratic Party, what few there are left, and a few of the sort of objectivists in the Republican Party, such as Rand Paul. So you could look at the Democratic Party and you could find people like Tulsi Gabbard, and well, he's not really a Democrat because he's not a member of the party, runs as an independent, blah, 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 but Bernie Sanders is not down with the neoliberal stuff either. But Rand Paul is not down with it either. And I guess there are some other Republicans, but he's the only one I can think of. Anyway, the teachers' revolt sparked by West Virginia has now spread to the bluest part of them all, California. LA's schools show why the crisis of public education can't be blamed only on Republicans. Huge class sizes, low per pupil funding, rampant charter schools, over-testing, a lack of counselors, nurses, and librarians. These are the fruit of years of Democratic rule in the city and the state capital. Explains United Teachers of Los Angeles, UTLA, Secretary Arlene Inouye. Corporate Democrats are getting money from the same billionaires and corporations as the Republicans. So essentially, all public educators in this country are targets, end quote. In Los Angeles, deep-pocketed pro-charter ideologues recently installed Austin Buettner, a billionaire investment banker with zero educational experience, as superintendent. Their plan is straightforward: drastically downsize the school district to push students into privately run charter schools. This is another scheme that the neoliberals do. They want to underfund or even defund public programs in an effort to then point at them and say, see, they're a failure, they're not working out, let's privatize this and let the private sector handle it. Well, they're not working out right because you're not giving them enough money to work out right. This is one of the problems with the veterans, VA hospitals and so forth, and VA clinics. If you don't give them enough money to do what they're supposed to do, they're obviously going to not be able to do what they're supposed to do. And that's what's been happening for quite some time with the VA. Anyway, despite the fact that the district is sitting on $1.86 billion in financial reserves, Buettner has refused to meet the union's basic demands for lower class size, more school resources, and charter accountability, since such improvements would undermine his privatizing mission. For Inouye, quote, this is a struggle to save public education. The existence of public education in our city is on the line, end quote. It's also a struggle over the future of the Democratic Party. Los Angeles is a microcosm of and a major front in a larger national battle that has pitted working-class insurgents like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez against the business-bought Democratic establishment. Though school privatization today is currently associated more with Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos, Democratic Party leaders have been just as responsible for the decimation of public education over recent years. And From Colorado to New York, top officials of the Democratic Party continue to promote the charter school agenda. Los Angeles is no exception. Austin Butner may look and act like the evil villain in a children's movie, but like most of the enemies of public education in Los Angeles and California, he's a liberal, a longtime party funder, and a proud Democrat. So are Nick Melvoin and Kelly Gonez, the swing vote school board members who rode into office last year in the most expensive school board race in U.S. history. Billionaire charter school backers like Eli Broad and Reed Hastings made over $9.7 million in contributions to ensure their election. Both Gonez and Melvoin worked in the Obama administration and are supported by Arne Duncan, Obama's infamously anti-union, pro-charter Secretary of Education. On a statewide level, California's Democratic governors and legislators who currently have a supermajority in Sacramento have done little to stem the tide of privatization, nor have Democrats taken steps to fully fund education by pushing to reform Proposition 13, the regressive anti-tax policy that has gutted state colleges since 1978, state coffers since 1978. As a result, to quote UTLA President Alex Caputo Pearl, quote, California, supposedly the pride and model of the Democratic Party, is at 43 out of 50 states in per-pupil funding, end quote. Unsurprisingly, Los Angeles isn't the only city in California on the verge of a teacher's strike. Oakland educators will very likely be going out in early 2019 as well. At best, the Democrats have upheld the status quo, but in California and across the nation, the status quo is no longer tolerable for millions. LA's strike, like the popular upsurge around Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, and their calls for Medicare for All and a Green New Deal, suggests that working people want a break with neoliberal austerity and are even willing to take drastic action to make that break happen. Elected in 2014 with a mandate to transform the union, the new UTLA leadership has spent the last 4 years preparing for this battle rather than sticking with the labor movement's self-defeating reliance on electing and lobbying mainstream Democrats. The union has consciously upheld the militant spirit of the 2012 Chicago teachers' strike and the recent Red State rebellions. Rosa Jimenez, a teacher in LA's Koreatown and a parent of a 5th grader, said, quote, I've been blown away by what we've been able to organize. We've been working so hard for so many years to get to this point, end quote. Winning won't be easy. Superintendent Butner is the mouthpiece of powerful economic and political interests, and he shows no signs of backing down. The powers that be understand that a victorious strike in Los Angeles could detonate a wave of similar actions in blue states across the nation. The spread of this kind of labor militancy would not only threaten their plans to downsize public education, it would also give unprecedented popular leverage to the electoral insurgency headed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, the only potential presidential contender to have consistently supported the strike wave. There is no way to predict today how these battles in Los Angeles and beyond will unfold. One thing does seem clear enough. One thing does seem clear, though. 2019 is shaping up to be another year of fiery teachers' strikes, and this time they won't only be targeting Republicans. Huzzah! I gotta say, huzzah! It's about time the Democrats were held accountable for some of their, some people would call it Republican light, but that's just really playing nice with the Democrats. They're not. They're just corporatist pimps, and that's as nice as I can put it. I mean, I can certainly describe it in other ways, but I'll try to be somewhat nice about it. I don't know why I should have to, but yeah, let's not get me kicked off of YouTube just yet, okay? So there's that. It's really interesting. There was a little girl who, a little over a year ago, tried to claim that the only thing I ever do on my YouTube channel is talk about how much I hate Republicans. I don't think I've ever said anything about hating Republicans. I'm not sure I've ever. The only thing I can recall actually addressing any Republicans, really, I mean, we've kind of mocked Mitch McConnell a few times, and I've probably said various things about Tom Cotton and a few others, Ted Cruz and so forth. But the only time I can remember devoting an entire video or stream to any Republican was just my response to President Trump's State of the Union address from 2017. I know from 2000, yeah, was it 2018? It was this year, yeah. Yeah, so, and I didn't respond to his full address. I think my my video was like an hour long or an hour and a half long, and I was like, oh, I'm tired of this shit, so I'm not going to go over the rest of it. But yeah, so yeah, the Blue State Revolt, I've got that link ready to go into the video description when the time comes. So now I want to talk a little bit about, and there's an article from The Hill that came out recently as well. Let me have a look over here and see if there be any feedback out here. Let's see. Well, libertarians are what I was describing when I was talking about neo-objectivists. The Libertarian Party is the, it should more properly be named the neo-objectivist party, because they have taken the objectivism of Ayn Rand and kind of, it's not quite the same as the objectivism she came up with, and apparently she despised them and said that they weren't actually objectivists. So, but they're obviously inspired by her to some extent, so I don't know what else to call them, and I'm not really sure how she thought they were different from what she was talking about. So I'm just going to call them neo-objectivists because I don't have a better name for them, and I object to them having usurped the name libertarian, which was previously the term used to refer to people who supported civil rights and civil liberties and opposed authoritarianism. Now, in order to describe someone as that kind of libertarian, you have to qualify it by saying something like civil libertarian or left libertarian or something like that. And a lot of people will look at you when you say you're a left libertarian, and they'll be like, that doesn't even make any sense. The libertarians are extreme right wing. And I'm like, well, no. First of all, the Libertarian Party, so-called Libertarian Party, is not extreme right wing. They are far right wing. So I mean, they are certainly right wing. But the word libertarian was in use a long time before 1971, December, when the Libertarian Party was formed. And yeah, I just don't like calling them libertarians because I don't think they deserve the name. The public educational system is one of the keys to maintaining a free society. And one of the reasons that we have the public education system is because prior forms of education were generally done in institutions run by various religious sects, and they didn't really educate so much as indoctrinate. So you would have students come out of, and once again it says the stream is complete. I don't know what the hell's going on. I should be, having very good, yeah, I've got 4G 3 bars. That's about as good as I ever get, unless I'm in the city where I can get 4 or 5 bars. But anyway, no, stream resumed, so fuck if I know what's going on. Oh, what do you mean when you say right wing, ground floor Guthrie? Because when I talk about right wing, right, left, and center to me are terms that apply to economic perspectives. If you're talking about right wing in terms of something else, then I don't know what you're talking about. Well, you know what? Right wing is an economic term. Left wing is an economic term. Leftist is an economic term. Centrist is an economic term. If you want to talk about attitudes toward... No, that's a conflation. This is the thing that I've bitched about repeatedly for years and years, the one-dimensional single-line continuum where left is conflated with liberal and right is conflated with conservative and center is conflated with moderate. We're talking about totally different dimensions here. When we talk about these terms, radical, progressive, liberal, limousine liberal, moderate, conservative, ultra-conservative, regressive, reactionary, those are terms that apply to attitudes toward changes in society and or culture. So those are two dimensions because society and culture are not exactly the same, but they are parallel. And economics is a different dimension. You've seen your political compass test, I'm sure, which shows you two dimensions. So instead of the one-dimensional single-line continuum, which was so popular in the 1950s, this thing comes out of... yes, it did start in France, just before the French Revolution, I believe, because they had the nobles who would sit on the right side and the kind of more populist people who would sit on the left side of the chamber. But as time has gone on, the terms have come to refer to other things specifically. And I can demonstrate this by talking about what do we generally mean when we talk about leftists. We mean Marxists and socialists, other types of socialists, I should say. I don't really know that I want to count Marxists as socialists since they see socialism as a stepping stone to get to Marxist communism, whereas other types of socialists see socialism as the desired type of economic system in itself. And socialism did exist before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. There were several other kinds of socialism which Marx and Engels criticized and referred to as utopian socialism, and they described their own take on socialism as scientific socialism, which is really quite rich since the scheme they came up with, what they described as the end result of what they saw coming down the pipe, what they thought would be the ideal society, the Marxist communist society, is really truly pie in the sky, by and by when you die kind of religious dogma. I don't see anything scientific about it. It's extremely utopian. How are you going to have a classless and stateless society blossom out of a dictatorship of the proletariat or otherwise? It's not. It doesn't even make sense, much less is it logical. But when you talk about the right-wing death squads in Central America in the 80s, why were they right-wing? Because they were killing Marxist revolutionaries. That's what they were fighting. They were fighting left-wing insurgency. Marxists who wanted to have a revolution in Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, all of those people that were being killed by right-wing death squads were Marxists. The right wing is about capitalism. It goes from right-leaning social democracy all the way to corporatism, and there are several forms of corporatism. But what I'm talking about is, see, non-aggression principle, we were talking about adding a bunch of extra stuff on to. what the economic perspective of the people who call themselves libertarians espouse. I'm not talking about all the extra crap. I'm just talking about their economic perspective. Their economic perspective is right-wing. I'm not talking about the non-aggression principle. That has nothing to do with left, right, or center. It has absolutely nothing to do with that because it's not an economic thing. I mean, certainly progressives are in favor of a non-aggression principle, although we don't call it that. We just call ourselves anti-war. It's been a thing among progressives going back to at least 1948. When Wallace opposed Truman's Cold War policies and buildup of the military and all of that stuff. To this day, when you talk with modern progressives, yeah, they are. The Austrian school is right-wing. It's a right-wing economic perspective. If you want to talk about left-wing economics, you're talking about anything from left-leaning social democracy all the way to the extreme left, which is Marxism. I mean, you can use the terms however you want, but this is the way I'm using them. And this is one of the reasons we talk in philosophy about defining terminology. It's one of the reasons why in polite academic discourse you're encouraged to define your terms up front so there's no misunderstanding. I've talked about these things many, many times in my articles and my videos. When I talk about right-wing, left-wing, and center, I'm talking about economics. I'm not talking about anything else. I'm certainly not talking about culture, and I'm not talking about society. And those are two different things. And if you're talking about culture war stuff, I don't believe in a culture war. I believe there is an ideological struggle, but it's not culture war. That name even comes from Bismarck, and what he was talking about was a struggle between the German state and the Catholic Church, largely to do with education, and to some extent it had to do with appointing bishops and stuff like that. So I mean, that was kind of a completely different thing than what we're talking about when we talk about regressive outrage mongers versus anti-authoritarian people. If you want to talk about regressive outrage mongers, you can call them neo-Puritans. That's another useful term. I mean, I know there are other names that are given to them by some people, and they seem to call themselves certain things as well. But I reject the name they give themselves, and I reject the name that some of their opponents give them, because both of them... Well, the name they give themselves is incorrect. It's a term they're trying to usurp. And the name their opponents give them, some of their opponents give them, is inaccurate. And then you've got another group of their opponents who call them something else as well, and that's not entirely accurate either. I mean, there's to talk about postmodernism or to talk about social justice, no, because they don't actually understand postmodernism or social justice, like so many of the other things they claim to espouse, these regressive outrage mongers. They don't really know what the hell they're talking about. They talk about intersectionality. They don't know what it means. You can go watch the keynote address that was given at the Women of the World Conference in 2016 by Kimberly Crenshaw, the woman who came up with the term intersectionality, and she states very bluntly she never intended for intersectionality to be about identity politics. The focus was never supposed to be identity. It was supposed to be on the structures which enable and facilitate oppression. So, and this is something that's been known for some years now, the idea that intersectionality in academia means something different from what intersectionality means among activists, that it's not the same thing, that they're talking about two different concepts, but using the same word. And this is one of the things I've talked about in my article at Real Progressives about the name progressive. I talk about Wittgenstein Ludwig Wittgenstein, who in his later phase discussed what he called Sprachspiele, which means language games. Now, a Sprachspiel is a certain way of using words. So, for example, in philosophy and theology and religion disciplines, so like if you go to like the Department of Religion or a Department of Theology or a Department of Philosophy at a university, they're going to use the term mysticism in a certain way. If, on the other hand, you go over to the social sciences division and hang out with the sociologists and the psychologists, they're going to use the term mysticism to mean something entirely different. So when you get these people together and they start talking, if they don't define their terms up front, it's entirely likely that there's going to be initially considerable misunderstanding, then frustration, and they might even get, into a tiff of sorts. What's going on there is that the people are playing two different Sprachspiele. So you have one group who's playing a Sprachspiel of the idea basically is you're playing a game using the same pieces but different rules. So when Wittgenstein talks about these language games, he means you're using language and you have these game pieces, which are words, and this other person or group is using the same language, and so you're playing on the same board basically. You have the same kind of board for your board game, and you're using the same words, so you have the same game pieces, but you're using those game pieces with different rules. That is, you're using words with different definitions. So when you come together, people will talk about yada yada yada, and they will mean what their discipline uses the word to mean. But if they're talking with people from another discipline, that other discipline may use the same word in a completely different way, wholly unrelated at all. So, for philosophers, theologians, scholars of religion, and so forth, mysticism refers to a series of doctrines and practices intended to facilitate union with the divine or the universe or nature or whatever, or whomever, or whatever. It can be any some kind of union, and it's not necessarily a monistic union like I'm a drop of water in the ocean and I become one with the divine. No, it can also be dualistic union. So there, for example, in Hinduism, there is in Vedanta philosophy in Hinduism, there is Dvaita and Advaita Vedanta. So Dvaita Vedanta is dualistic Hinduism, and it believes that the worshipper and the supreme Godhead, supreme personality of divinity, which is Bhagavan, will always be separate from one another. But they will have a union that is a dualistic union. It's like a dance, or like blending into each other and out of each other at the same time, or like a marriage, or, there are a number of different metaphors that are used to talk about it. Whereas Advaita Vedanta Hinduism looks into things like Isha Upanishad, which is one of the Upanishads, and they think that Maya, or illusion, is separate identity, separate existence, that everything is really one, and all persons are one, and I am one with the divine. Tat tvam asi, as they would say, thou art that. You're not just Brahman, you're not just Paramatman, you are Bhagavan. There's a passage in Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says to Arjuna that some worship the countless gods which are only my million faces. There's another passage where anyway, the point is, this is what mysticism is in those fields of study. But in the early 20th century, the social sciences engaged in a lot of semantic revisionism. They took a lot of common terms that were used in academia and decided to give them their own definitions. So for them, mysticism came to mean irrationality. And when they talk about something being mystical, they don't mean what theologians and priests and philosophers mean when they talk about something being mystical. They mean, when they say mystical as psychology and sociology, they mean irrational. That's just what it means to them. So if you come together, these two groups of people come together and start talking, and the subject mysticism comes up, they're not going to understand each other, and they're going to become very frustrated, and might even, it's theoretically possible they could come to blows, right? So, that's the thing. I've been politically active my entire adult life. I'm in my 50s. I've studied philosophy and history and various other things, languages, linguistics. And leftism to me means socialism, basically. It means anything from the extreme left of Marxism through various kinds of socialism back to the center, which is social democracy. Now, social democracy is right dead set at the center, but there is left-tinged social democracy, which is just not really left of center. It's just kind of looking in the left direction. And then there's left-leaning social democracy, which is just a little bit left of center, but still close enough to the center to be considered centrist. So from that all the way to Marxism, that's leftism to me. And from right-leaning social democracy all the way to corporatism, with capitalism on the way, that is right-wing. Now, you can also talk about mercantilism and feudalism and tribalism and toss those in there, but they don't really apply because we're talking about modern economic systems. I don't want to annoy any of the neo-tribalists because I agree with them to a large extent. But the point is that in first world countries, there's not a lot of tribal economy going on, except in, like, say, First Nations or Native American reservations and so forth. You might still see some of that kind of economic system in existence, which is very similar to the type of socialism I espouse, which is called cooperative commonwealth socialism. And so, there's this whole thing about what socialism and communism and all this stuff means. You've got the idea that you have from a lot of right-wingers who say that socialism is all about big government, it's about government ownership of everything, it's blah, blah, blah. No, none of that is true. Even Marxist communism is supposed to be a stateless society. What Stalin and Mao did was to try to transform their respective countries from a largely feudal economy into something which could become a socialist economy. And they never actually got to they certainly never got to communism. There are some who would say that they never made it to socialism because what they had to do was industrialize their nations. And the reason they felt they had to do this was because, according to Marx, you go from capitalism to socialism to communism. If you don't have capitalism already, you can't go to socialism. And the only way you can have capitalism is to industrialize. So, Stalin got the idea of industrializing the Soviet Union by having the state become the sole capitalist. It replaced the factory owners and the landlords, and it became the factory owner and the landlord. It wasn't until some time later that you started to have workers' cooperatives forming in the Soviet Union. And another thing that's not really widely known about the Soviet Union is that the word Soviet actually means council in Russian. There were originally several different Soviets in the Soviet Union after the 1917 revolutions. So you would have like regional and local Soviets. There were workers' councils. Stalin, and to some extent Lenin, but mostly Stalin, got rid of the different Soviets and consolidated his power until there was only one Soviet left, and that's what was known as the Supreme Soviet. If you're familiar at all with USSR history, you will have heard of the Supreme Soviet, and Stalin was the head of that. So he had basically gotten rid of all of Trotsky's supporters and ran Trotsky off or whatever, and got rid of all the regional and local Soviets, and just had the Supreme Soviet, so that instead of having these local economies, he had central economic planning, and instituted a program of, it talks about the 5-year plan, the second 5-year plan is a failure, and so forth and so on. Those 5-year plans were attempts to industrialize Russia, or at this point the entire Soviet Union, because you have to have an industrialized society to go to socialism, according to Marx. Now, I don't agree. Socialism has existed forever, in some sense, in that the cooperative commonwealth that I talk about is the cooperative economy is the model of tribal societies, particularly in Ireland and Scotland in the Iron Age and early medieval period. You have a decentralized polity, so you have that local economy. You have the individual members of the tribe working together, cooperating with each other, sharing resources, not in common, but like, say, okay, I'll give you an example from American rural societies that I can remember in my living memory, and it's still done a little bit, but not like it was. And it was certainly done in the 1930s, because it's the only way anybody survived the Great Depression. They even did this in Los Angeles. There were people that would go out of the city, out to the farms, and work in the farms. And it was basically a cooperative economy. There was no money to go around, so what they would do is, Joe or whatever down the road here has a tractor, and he comes up here and he plows my field with it. He uses his turning disc, and he goes out and plows the field. And then Frank has a tiller, and he comes and tills my field. Well, I plant the seeds, I weed the crops, I pull the tomato hookworms off, and, all this other kind of stuff. I take care of the crops myself. I make sure they get water and keep the bugs away and keep the rabbits away and things like that. And then when the harvest comes in, I give a portion of the produce to Joe and Frank, because they came and helped me out. So it's that kind of cooperation for the good of the whole as well as the individual. And this is neither collectivist nor individualist. It's not a blend of the two either. It's something else entirely. This is another thing that I bitch about. I've been bitching about this for 20 years. Bifurcation fallacy, the idea that there are two tiny little boxes into which everyone and everything must fit. One or the other. You've got to be one or the other. You can't be a green, or you can't be a libertarian. You have to be a Republican or a Democrat. Well, fuck you guys, man. I can be whatever I want. I don't need your shit. I don't like the Democrats or the Republicans. So, I'll be what I want. And if that means I'm an independent, if that means I'm a green, if that means I'm a socialist alternative, it means what? It doesn't matter. I don't have to join your fucking parties. I don't have to vote for your fucking candidates. Because I don't like them, right? This kind of dialectic, essentially, between collectivism and individualism is some shit that Ayn Rand dreamed up. I mean, she wasn't the first. and certainly wasn't the last to talk about it, but she kind of emphasized it more than others had previously. And it's bullshit, because collectivism is everything owned in common, and you don't have that in cooperativism. And individualism is I own my shit, and you don't even have that in capitalism. You have families who own property, for example. Not just one person. I mean, you certainly do have instances of one person owning this, but you also have instances of a couple owning together, or a family owning together. You've got family cooperatives, family farms, you know, and even the corporation itself is a corporate entity. Corporate meaning collective. It's a collective entity. It's a group of people who own, shareholders, and so forth. So it's a bullshit. It's not just a bifurcation fallacy. It's a false dilemma, quite frankly. And I mean, bifurcation fallacy is a type of false dilemma, but by saying false dilemma, it makes it more obvious what I mean. It's a lie. It's not that simple. It's not that you can separate everything into collectivism versus individualism. There are blends of this throughout all kinds of economic perspectives and everything else. And those are not the only options either. It's not just collectivism or individualism or a blend of the two. There are other things you can do, like cooperativism, where everybody owns their own shit, but they cooperate with each other for the good of the individual and the good of the tribe. So, I mean, I can go on and on about this, but I would like to get back to the discussions, to the articles. Corporatism is either union of or collusion between state and corporate power. There are at least two forms of corporatism. Mussolini referred to fascism as corporatism. Actually, I think that was what the fuck was that guy's name? It wasn't Mussolini. It was the guy that wrote all the dogma of fascism in Italy. But he attributed it to Mussolini, and Mussolini may have actually said it. I don't know. But the only recorded source of it is in this book by this dude, and he attributed it to Mussolini, but there's no other record of Mussolini saying it. So a lot of modern neo-fascists look at that and say, well, Mussolini didn't really say that. That comes out of that book by such and such. Yeah, but he said Mussolini said it, and he knew Mussolini, so maybe Mussolini did say it. What the fucking do? It doesn't matter. The point was fascism and corporatism are the same thing, basically. But not really. All fascists are corporatists, but not all corporatists are fascists. And so fascism is one type of corporatism. Another type of corporatism is neoliberalism. Now, they differ from each other in a number of rhetorical ways. I went through this last week, I think, on this show, probably the week before that. And so yeah, let me just, so I don't want to belabor this point over and over and over again, because I'll get the same kind of shit I've gotten before for saying the same things over and over and over again. But as I've tried to explain to this particular person, there may be people who've never watched one of my videos or streams before. There may have been people who've never read any of my articles or my blog posts or paid attention to my Twitter or anything else I've ever done, and so are not going to know what I'm talking about. So, you know, it's okay for me to repeat myself. We'll make a video where you talk about it. Okay, and what if they just show up in a live stream and they're talking to me in the live chat, like right now? We'll go watch this video. That's not, you know, that's not really gonna work out. I'm having a dialogue with people in the chat here. The real substantial difference between neoliberalism and fascism is in which of the partners has the upper hand. So in both of them, there is collusion between state and corporate power. But in fascism, the state retains the upper hand. The state runs they will certainly subsidize corporations and industries. They will give bailouts. They will prop up, give tax cuts and tax incentives and deregulation and anti-labor policies, blah, 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 blah. They'll do all of that, yeah? But they only do it so that the corporations will serve the interests of the state. And these are often militaristic interests. So the state retains the upper hand. It's in control and so on. But in neoliberalism, the state becomes the servant of corporate interests. And you have this kind of, as I've said before, revolving door between the private sector and the public sector. So you've got like administrative cabinet positions that are filled by people from the private sector. That's why you've got Goldman Sachs executives coming in to run the Federal Exchange Commission and shit like that. And then when they leave, they go back to work in the same industry they came out of. You've got people who come out of the banking industry who go work for the FDIC, and then they go back to the banking industry. You've got people who worked for Verizon or Altel or Cox or Comcast or one of these other kind of internet service providers, cell phone companies, landline phone companies, and they're kind of all blending together now. CenturyLink, for example, has ground landlines phone company, but it also has fiber optic cable internet, right? And so I guess Cox does cable and internet, and so you've got these telecommunications industries and companies, and you've got people who come out. For example, Ajit Pai worked with or for Verizon, and now he's the head of the FCC, and expects he's going to go back into Verizon or a similar company when he leaves his current position as chairman of the FCC. So you've also got lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, who write legislation and give it to senators and representatives who then introduce it as a bill on the floor of the House or the Senate. And you've got this whole Citizens United versus the FEC decision by the Supreme Court, where it's considered to be freedom of speech for corporations to give money to candidates and parties. So you've got these huge corporate donations coming from corporate PACs and lobbyists to candidates and so forth. Yes, libertarians do oppose corporatism, but there are some similarities. As I said before, libertarian is what you're calling libertarian, what I call neo-objectivist and objectivist. They are economically far right, but corporatists are extreme right. So they're like fanatical right wing, and libertarians are not quite that far. Both certainly all extreme right is far right, but not all far right is extreme right. That kind of thing. I mean, certainly the objectivists and neo-objectivists would be opposed to subsidizing corporations. They would be opposed to bailing out too big to fail banks, and neoliberals are all for that. And fascists are for it if it benefits the state. I don't think objectivists and neo-objectivists would be too keen on having a revolving door policy between the corporate world and government cabinet positions and so forth. But anyway, no, they are right-wing. Right-wing, again, is anything from right-leaning social democracy through capitalism to corporatism. So you have your objectivists and neo-objectivists who would be capitalists and basically laissez-faire capitalists. But the corporatists have like taken what Marx would have called late-stage capitalism and exposed it to radiation so that it mutated into a creature that should never have existed, you know. And so, and social democracy is something that almost everyone that I can think of, first world country, is a social democracy, including the United States, and has been since FDR. Social democracy is a blend, a mixed economy. It's a blend of capitalism and socialism. So it has some capitalist elements and it has some socialist elements. Social programs, the social safety net, things like Tennessee Valley Authority, the FDIC, Glass-Steagall Act, those kind of things, regulations on industries and corporations, those kind of things would be considered socialist policies. Now, they're not in and of themselves sufficient to be considered socialism, which is one of the things the Republicans get wrong. Well, that's just socialism. No. These are socialist policies, but this is not socialism. This is a social democracy because we've also still got a more or less free market, and we've still got private ownership of, factories and so forth. The thing about socialism is not nationalization of everything. The basic ideal of socialism is that the means of production should be owned and controlled by the producers. Now, then you get into disagreements about exactly how to accomplish that. And that's one of the big points of contention that leads to different kinds of socialism. So you would have some kinds of what would be called state socialists who believe that the government should seize everything and own it in common for the producers. And then you've got people like myself who believe that the people who actually work in the goddamn factory should own the factory, not the government, not Joe Fred Goobersnatch the Fourth, who inherited it from daddy's daddy, but the people who actually do the job. And they should manage it as well because they're the ones who know what's possible. They're the ones who know what can and can't be done with the tools they have and have maybe some ideas for better tools. But you can't just have it like an absolute free-for-all democracy. You have to have foremen and managers. The thing is, though, you don't want to hire some guy who just came out of school with a bachelor's in business administration or an MBA or whatever, who has no experience whatsoever in this particular industry. You want someone who has been working here and understands what the job is, what the workers have to do, what they have been going through, what is possible, how fast things can be done, how fast they can't be done, what else can't be done, and so on and so forth. These are the people who've been with the company for a long enough period of time. They've worked in the factory there. They may have worked their way up from, apprentice to master of their craft or whatever. And they have the experience, they have the skills, they have the training. They may have worked every frickin' machine in the factory, and so they know what is what. Those are the people that would be elected to be foreman and management of the factory. And, it's not just factories. We're talking about, there are cooperatives like grocery stores, like Winco, for example, which pays its employees who are not employees but associates, real associates, because they are part owners of the store. They pay them better than Walmart does, even though Walmart calls their employees associates too. But so, you do have these cooperative grocery stores, and some of them are chains like Winco. where the employees owned the company. There's what the heck is the there's some kind of software company in, I think it's in Seattle, that the members, the people who work at the company own the company. It was originally owned by this one dude, and he decided that it would be better and more beneficial to the company itself as well as to the people who worked there if he transformed it into a cooperative. So they all just basically bought into the company, all the employees. And that's the way you get a cooperative. A lot of people are like, well, how are you going to do this without forcing people to do it? Well, dude, people buy companies and buy stock and buy shares, in corporations all the time. What you do is make, first option available to the employees. They buy into the corporation. They become part owners of the company. This is how you form a cooperative without taking an AK-47 out and blowing off the owner's head or something. You don't have to bring out the guillotines. This can all be done peacefully and democratically, and no violence involved. None of that has to happen. But if there's a saying, I think it was, who was it? Who was it? Was it? It might have been John F. Kennedy who said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." So I mean, Franklin Roosevelt told these industrialists back in 1933 that either you let me do this New Deal, or the people are going to rise up just like they did in St. Petersburg in 1917. And he was right. There were communists and socialists all over America at the time, and they were pissed. And they were ready to, break out the guillotines and stuff. But anyway, let me go on. I'm going to... No. I'm not going to exclude. See, the thing is, there's no such thing as private property will exist. I mean, certainly, we're talking about the means of production. Okay, the means of production is not the same thing as like me having my own house and my own car and my own computer and stuff like that. Okay, yes, I can produce things on my computer like videos, live streams, articles, art, blah, blah, blah. But it's not really the means of production. It's not. Means of production is a different thing from private property. Now, you will have some people who will talk about private property versus personal property. I think that's a bullshit argument. I'm not even going to go into it. And they will say that personal property is things like your house and your car and your toothbrush and your computer and, shit like that. And private property is capital. Nah, fuck off with that shit. That's not... There's not even any reason to go into this kind of semantic revisionism. Private property is private property, period. It's just property that's owned by a private individual or by a family or whatever. But the means of production, we're talking about things like factories and... trucking companies and train companies and things that can transport and produce and distribute and sell. Those are means of production, essentially. And I mean, it's not always about just producing a particular product. It's also about getting the product to a place where it can be marketed and then marketing it. So all of that is part of production. That's why your trucking company or the train company or the supermarket would be considered, or the store that sells your shoes, or all this kind of stuff. These are all a means of production. Now the thing is, if the only person who works in the fucking place is one dude, the cobbler who makes the shoes also sells the shoes, hey, that is the producer owning the means of production. So that's both private property and a cooperative, because the only fucking person who works there owns it and runs it. See, So, I mean, there is that thing there, too. And I think this is an artificial, arbitrary kind of division that doesn't really need to exist, where people just start pissing themselves over things that are really just people are trying to define too rigidly. Now, there is a reason for rigid definitions, but on some things I think it's a little unnecessary. You know, I mean, you don't have to define everything right down to the very tiniest detail. Some things can be left a little bit vague. And then other things you do want to define right down to the tiniest little detail, because they shouldn't be left vague. And don't ask me for examples, because I won't be able to think of any right now. Anyway, so I'm going to go on and... yes, as, who was it that said, I know that Mr. Spock is credited as saying it, but I think it actually comes from somewhere else, and I forget now. A difference which makes no difference is no difference. So, and that actually is not from one of the shows, but from one of the novels, and I think it is Spock Must Die by James Blish. Anyway, I'm going to go on to the next article, and I've finished up the Blue State Revolt. I may not be able to go over all these articles tonight, because I've been going now for an hour and 45 minutes, and I didn't really want to go for 2 hours. So I'm going to try to run through a few more of these at least. Let's see what I've got here. I do want to talk about this Green New Deal business a bit, and a little bit about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And there's some other things here that I would like to go over, so I don't know. I may just do a second part of the stream sometime tomorrow. But let me see where I'm at here. There's another thing that I want to talk about, and there have been a couple of other people that have talked about it already today. Jimmy Dore did a video on it. I think it might have been Kyle Kulinski or someone else did a video on it anyway. I don't remember who it was, but I know that Jimmy Dore did. So the thing that I'm talking about here is okay. So I'm gonna put up a. Oh no, I'm not, because I don't have it. I thought I did, but I didn't get it. So there's an article at The Hill. There's an article at The Hill called "Russian Disinformation Campaign Included Pro-Jill Stein Sentiments." Okay, this is from the 18th of December. It's by Justin Wise, and it says, Russia's online disinformation campaign included messaging that supported 2016 Green Party presidential nominee Jill Stein, according to a new report prepared for the Senate Intelligence Committee. The report, which was produced by researchers from the firm New Knowledge, said the Russian troll farm known as the Internet Research Agency, or IRA, used. Oh, I know DGJ, Miss Andrew Today channel, did a video about this too. Used every major social media platform. CNN first noted that this campaign had messaging that included support for Stein's third-party candidacy. It also included support for Hillary Clinton's Democratic primary opponent, Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont. And it goes on. This is a bunch of shit. And I'm about to tell you why. And you know, again, DDJ and Jimmy Dore have both talked about this already, so it's not like I'm breaking news here. Certainly won't be, because there are articles about it, one of which I'm about to read. But I will point out that the Internet Research Agency had allegedly run ads and published memes on social media that not only were pro-Jill Stein and pro-Bernie Sanders, they also did some that were pro-Donald Trump. They did some that were pro-Hillary, which you're not going to hear that from these fucks here in the mainstream media. One moment. So, not only that, but if you go through this collection of stuff that is supposedly pro-Jill Stein, you find out very quickly that it's not all pro-Jill Stein. It's just stuff that mentions Jill Stein. And some of it is anti-Jill Stein. So, and it's all from the same source. I mean, I've talked about the Internet Research Agency before in these videos and streams. The fact is that this is not something new. The people who thought they broke this with Mueller and all that shit, man, there was a New York Times article about this like 4 years ago. And the guy that did it was like, they're just trying to figure out how to be effective at running ads. They're not really interested in, disinformation or propaganda or influencing an election or anything like that. I mean, they've talked to this guy, the reporter who broke the news about them back in 2014 or whatever. They've talked to him since then, in 2016, 2017, and he said the same thing. They don't know what they're doing. They're just trying to figure out what they're doing. They're trying to figure out how to market whatever it is they're going to market eventually to the right people, and so on. But here's the real reason why this is bullshit. I'm about to tell you. So there is a. Let me see here. First, I'm gonna take you to The Nation. I think this is by Aaron Mate. Yeah, it's The Nation. It was published today, this morning. Well, yesterday now for Eastern Central time zones, but and yesterday for Europe, but it was published on the 28th, and it is by Aaron Mate. Yeah, at The Nation. New studies show pundits are wrong about Russian social media involvement in U.S. politics. Far from being a sophisticated propaganda campaign, it was a small, amateurish, and mostly unrelated to the 2016 election. This is exactly what the guy who first broke news about the Internet Research Agency in the New York Times wrote in the New York Times back, some years ago. So Aaron Mate used to be at the Real News Network, if you're not familiar with him, and just recently left there and has gone to work for The Nation. So he's talking about the same group that The Hill was just talking about from an article yesterday, the 27th, or the 18th, or whenever it was, I forget now. The release of 2 Senate commissioned reports has sparked a new round of panic about Russia manipulating a vulnerable American public on social media. Headlines warn that Russian trolls have tried to suppress the African-American vote, promote Green Party candidate Jill Stein, recruit assets, and sow discord or hack the 2016 election via sex toy ads and Pokemon Go. David Ignatius of the Washington Post wrote, quote, "The studies describe a sophisticated, multi-level Russian effort to use every available tool of our open society to create resentment, mistrust, and social disorder," end quote, demonstrating that the Russians, quote, "thanks to the internet, seem to be perfecting these dark arts," end quote. According to Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times, quote, "It looks increasingly as though Russian disinformation changed the direction of American history," end quote, in the narrowly decided 2016 election, when, quote, "Russian trolling easily could have made the difference," end quote. Okay, now, the gray lady ain't what she used to be, and WAPU as anybody who's familiar with the history of the paper knows, has long been a mouthpiece for the Central Intelligence Agency, and its current owner, Jeff Bezos, also owner of Amazon, has a $600 million contract with the CIA per year. So, yeah, okay. You say at least one grain of salt to take with this. But Aaron goes on and he says, the reports from the University of Oxford's Computational Propaganda Research Project and the firm New Knowledge do provide the most thorough look at Russian social media activity to date. With an abundance of data, charts, graphs, and tables, coupled with extensive qualitative analysis, the authors scrutinize the output of the Internet Research Agency, or IRA, the Russian clickbait firm indicted by Special Counsel Robert Mueller in February 2018. On every significant metric, it is difficult to square the data with the dramatic conclusions that have been drawn. 2016 election content. The most glaring data point is how minimally Russian social media activity pertained to the 2016 campaign. The New Knowledge report acknowledges that evaluating IRA content, quote, purely based on whether it definitively swung the election is too narrow a focus, end quote, as the, quote, explicitly political content was a small percentage, end quote. To be exact, just, quote, 11% of the total content, end quote, attributed to the IRA, and 33% of user engagement with it, quote, was related to the election, end quote. The IRA's posts, quote, were minimally about the candidates, end quote, with, quote, roughly 6% of tweets, 18% of Instagram posts, and 7% of Facebook posts, end quote, having, quote, mentioned Trump or Clinton by name, end quote. Scale. The researchers claimed that, quote, the scale of the operation was unprecedented, end quote. But they based that conclusion on dubious figures. They repeat the widespread claim that Russian posts, quote, reached 126 million people on Facebook, end quote, which is in fact a spin on Facebook's own guess. Facebook's Colin Stretch testified to Congress in October 2017, quote, our best estimate is that approximately 126 million people may have been served one of these stories at some time during the 2-year period, end quote, between 2015 and 2017. According to Stretch, posts generated by suspected Russian accounts showing up in Facebook's newsfeed amounted to, quote, approximately 1 out of 23,000 pieces of content, end quote. Spending. Also hurting the case that the Russians reached a large number of Americans is that they spent such a microscopic amount of money to do it. Oxford puts the IRA's Facebook spending between 2015 and 2017 at just $73,711. As was previously known, about $46,000 was spent on Russian-linked Facebook ads before the 2016 election. That amounts to about 0.05% of the $81 million spent on Facebook ads by the Clinton and Trump campaigns combined. A recent disclosure by Google that Russian-linked accounts spent, get this, $4,700 on platforms in 2016. $4,700. A recent disclosure by Google that Russian... Now I'm going to read it again because you did hear that right. A recent disclosure by Google that Russian-linked accounts spent $4,700 on platforms in 2016 only underscores how minuscule that spending was. The researchers also claimed that the IRA's, quote, manipulation of American political discourse had a budget that exceeded $25 million USD, end quote. But that number is based on a widely repeated error that mistakes the IRA's spending on U.S.-related activities for its parent project's overall global budget, including domestic social media activity in Russia. Sophistication? Another reason to question the operation's sophistication can be found by simply looking at its offerings. The IRA's most shared pre-election Facebook post was a cartoon of a gun-wielding Yosemite Sam. Over on Instagram, the best received image urged users to give it a like if they believe in Jesus. The top IRA post on Facebook before the election to mention Hillary Clinton was a conspiratorial screed about voter fraud. It's telling that those who are so certain Russian social media posts affected the 2016 election never cite the posts that they think actually helped achieve that end. The actual content of those posts might explain why. Covert or clickbait operation? Far from exposing a sophisticated propaganda campaign, the reports provide more evidence that the Russians were actually engaging in clickbait capitalism, targeting unique demographics like African Americans or evangelicals in a bid to attract large audiences for commercial purposes. Commercial purposes, just like the reporter who said so before. Reporters who have profiled the IRA have commonly described it as, quote, a social media marketing campaign, end quote. Mueller's indictment of the IRA disclosed that it sold, quote, promotions and advertisements on its pages that generally sold in the $25 to $50 range. Oxford observes, quote, this strategy is not an invention for politics and for an intrigue. It is consistent with techniques used in digital marketing, end quote. New Knowledge notes that the IRA even sold merchandise that, quote, perhaps provided the IRA with a source of revenue, end quote, hawking goods such as T-shirts, quote, LGBT-positive sex toys, and many variants of triptych and 5-panel artwork featuring traditionally conservative patriotic themes, end quote. Oh my goodness, it provided them with a source of revenue. Well, okay, what did they do with it? What did they do with the revenue? What did they do? $4,700 were spent on Google platforms, including YouTube. Okay? $4,700. Jesus Christ. If that's all it takes to defeat the mighty Hillbot, the mighty Hildebeest or whatever, then, you know, so I can do that. I'll just go fucking make some ads right now and run for president myself in 2020. Fuck that, right? I'll just elect myself president by spending $4,700 on fucking Google. Goddamn, I swear these people are fucking stupid, or they think we are. Asset development? Lest one wonder how promoting sex toys might factor into a sophisticated influence campaign, the New Knowledge report claims that exploiting sexual behavior was a key component of the IRA's expansive human asset recruitment strategy in the United States. Quote, recruiting an asset by exploiting a personal vulnerability, end quote. The report explains, quote, is a timeless espionage practice, end quote. The first example of... oh my God. The first example... oh my God. The first example of this timeless espionage practice is of an ad... featuring Jesus consoling a dejected young man by telling him, quote, struggling with the addiction to masturbation, reach out to me and we will beat it together. Oh my. Oh my goodness. I can't read any more of this. Oh my God. And it's even got a picture. I mean, seriously. Over 56% of these ads were not seen until after the election. So, oh my God. They really fucking turned the election by... with that Jesus masturbation ad, right? I mean, come on. How fucking stupid do these fucking idiots think we are? But it gets even better. Wait. It definitely gets better. Because guess what else happens? Oh yes, there is indeed more. Oh! Yes, there's more. Oh my goodness, oh my gosh. Okay, so, oh my god. Okay, so this next article comes from Gray Zone Project. Wow. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Gray Zone. Original journalism and analysis edited by Max Blumenthal. So, this article is by Dan Cohen, and it was published, I think it was published the 28th, which would have been today, a little while ago. Oh my goodness. Excuse me to the 0 people still watching. Goodness. Senate report on Russian interference was written by disinformation warriors behind Alabama false flag operation. Yes, you see, it gets better. Hailed by Congress and the media as defenders of democracy. My goodness. Hailed by Congress and the media as defenders of democracy. High-tech Russiagate hustlers Jonathan Morgan and Ryan Fox have been exposed for waging an elaborate false flag operation to swing the 2017 Alabama Senate race. On December 17th, hold on, I've got to get something to drink. Gosh. I probably shouldn't have eaten that hamburger tonight because wow. Oh. Goodness gracious. I'm sorry. I will probably edit all this crap out. But God. On December 17th, 2 reports detailing ongoing Russian interference operations commissioned by the Senate Intelligence Committee were made public. They generated a week's worth of headlines and sent members of Congress and cable news pundits into a Cold War frenzy. According to the report, everything from the Green Party's Jill Stein to Instagram to Pokemon Go to the African American population had been used and confused by the deceptive Facebook pages of a private Russian troll farm called the Internet Research Agency. Never mind that 56% of the troll farm's pages appeared after the election, that 25% of them were seen by no one, or that their minuscule online presence paled in comparison to the millions of dollars spent on social media by the 2 major presidential campaigns and their supporters to sway voters. This was an act of war that demanded immediate government action. According to Senator Mark Warner, the Democratic chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the reports were, quote, a wake-up call, end quote, and a bombshell that was certain to bring, quote, long overdue guardrails when it comes to social media, end quote. As Jimmy Dore pointed out, guardrails means censorship. His Republican counterpart on the committee, North Carolina Senator Richard Burr, hailed the research papers as, quote, proof positive that one of the most important things we can do is increase information sharing between the social media companies who can identify disinformation campaigns and the third-party experts who can analyze them, end quote. And then there's a tweet. Good gods, I've got to have something else to drink here. Let me see what I got. Yeah, I'll have this. Alright, so excuse me just one moment, because I think I might have to take an antihistamine to try and avert the allergic reaction to something I ate earlier. I mean, yes, laughing like a maniac didn't help, but what I'm experiencing right now is something else. So hopefully this will help. I don't know. All right. I don't know. I think I'm gonna have to. I may have to just go ahead and end this and finish up tomorrow. Sometime. Oh my God. Yeah, I think I better. Anyway, if this stream has survived, which is by no means certain, since I disconnected at least twice for no apparent reason, you can look for the for the links in the video description. I'm not going to add them tonight because I'm in agony right now. I'm gonna have to. Yeah, if you've enjoyed this, any of this at least, if you've enjoyed any of this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Click the bell icon to be notified of all new content. I promise I don't cough and. Well, I promise I don't cough all the time, and I don't lose the ability to speak because of other things that are acid reflux, if you must know. Goodness. Yeah. So I mean, and if you would like to help me buy more Nexium and stuff like that, and maybe even healthier food that might not trigger my acid reflux, please consider becoming my patron on Patreon. The link is in the video description. Oh my goodness. For Republic News, this is Liviana. Goodness. Wow, we... Oh, goodness gracious me. For Republic News, this is Liviana signing off.